Chapter 1 Operation Luch. St. Petersburg. It's early February 1992, and an official's car from the city administration is slowly driving down the main streets of the city. A greyish slush has partially swept from the pavements, and people are trudging through the cold in thick anonymous coats, laden with bags and hunched against the wind. Behind the fading facades of the once grand houses of the Nevsky Prospects, shop stands almost empty, their shelves practically bare in the aftershock of the Soviet Union's sudden implosion. It's barely 6 weeks since the Soviet Union ceased to exist, since the fateful day when Russian President Boris Yeltsin and the leaders of the Soviet Republic signed their union out of existence with a stroke of a pen. The city's food distributors are struggling to react to the rapid change as the strict Soviet regulations that, for decades, controlled supply chains and fixed prices suddenly cease to exist. In the bus queues, and as the impromptu markets that have sprung up across the city as inhabitants seek to earn cash, selling shoes and other items from their homes, the talk all of winter has been of food shortages, ration cards, and gloom. Making matters worse, hyperinflation is ravaging savings. Some have even warned of a famine. Sounding alarm bells across the city, still gripped with memories of the Second World War's blockade, when up to 1,000 people starved to death each day. But the city official behind the wheel of the Black Volga said and looks calm. The slight, resolute figure gazing intently ahead is Vladimir Putin. He is 39, deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, and recently appointed the head of the city's Foreign Relations Committee. The scene is being filmed for a series of documentaries on the city's new administration, and this one centres on the youthful-looking deputy mayor whose responsibilities include ensuring adequate imports of food. As the footage flickers back to his office in the city hall at Smolny, Putin reels off a string of figures on the tons of grain and humanitarian aid being shipped in from Germany, England, and France. There is no need for worry, he says. Nearly 10 minutes is spent on the careful explanation of the measures his committee have taken to secure emergency supplies of food, including a groundbreaking deal for £20 million worth of livestock grain secured from a meeting between the city's mayor, Anthony 𝙲𝚊𝚙𝚘, and British Prime Minister John Major. Without this act of generosity from the UK, the region's livestock would not have survived, he says. His command of the detail is impressive. So too is his grasp of the vast problems facing the city's economy. He speaks with fluency of the need to develop a class of small and medium business owners as the backbone of the new market economy. Indeed, he says, the entrepreneurial class should become the basis of the flourishing of our society as a whole. He speaks with precision on the problems of converting the region's vast Soviet defense enterprises to civilian production in order to keep them alive. Sprawling plants like the Kravovsky Zavod, a vast artillery and tank producer in the south of the city, has been the region's main employer since the Tsarist times. Now they were at a standstill, as the endless order for military hardware that fueled and eventually bankrupted the Soviet economy had suddenly dried up. We have to bring in the Western partners and integrate the plants into the global economy, said the young city official. With sudden intensity, he speaks of the harm communism brought in, artificially cutting off the Soviet Union from the free market relations linking the rest of the developed world. The credos of Marx and Lenin brought colossal losses to our country, he says. There was a period of my life when I studied the theories of Marxism and Leninism, and I found them interesting, like many of us, logical. But as I grew up, the truth became ever more clear to me. These theories were no more than harmful fairy tales. Indeed, Bolshevik revolutionaries of the year 1917 were responsible for the tragedy we are experiencing today. The tragedy of the collapse of our state. He boldly tells the interviewer. They cut the country up into republics that did not exist before. Then they destroyed what unites the people of the civilized country. They destroyed the market relations. It is just a few months since the appointment as deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, but already it is a powerful, carefully crafted performance. He sits casually, saddling a chair backwards, but everything else points to precision and preparation. The 55-minute film shows him on a judo mat flipping opponents over his shoulder, speaking fluent German with a visiting businessman, and taking calls from Sobchak about the latest foreign aid deals. His meticulous preparation extends to the man he specifically requested to conduct the interview and direct the film, a documentary filmmaker known and loved across the Soviet Union for a series he had made intimately charting the lives of groups of Soviet children. A Soviet version of the popular UK TV show 7 Up. Igor Shabkan is a Jew, who recently returned to St. Petersburg from making a series of films on horrors of the Soviet gulags in the far north. A man who still flinches at the memory of the anti-Semitic slurs from the Soviet times, and who, by his own admittance, still ducks his head in fear whenever he passes the former headquarters of the KGB on the city's Litany prospects. Yet, this is the man Putin chose to help him with very special revelation, the man who will convey to the world the fact that Putin had served as an officer in the feared, hated KGB. It is still the first wave of the democracy movement, a time when admitting this could compromise his boss, Sobchak, a rousing orator who rose to mayor on a tide of condemnation of the secrets of the old regime, of the abuses perpetrated by the KGB. To this day, 𝙲𝚑𝚘𝚗 still questions whether Putin's choice was part of a careful rehabilitation plan. I always ask why he chose me. He understood that I was needed, and he was ready to tell me he was from the KGB. Putin chose well. A critic once told me that I always humanized my subject matters. No matter who they were, 𝙲𝚑𝚘𝚗 recalls. I humanized him. I wanted to know who he was and what did he see. I was a person who had always criticized the Soviet authorities. I endured a lot from them, but I was sympathetic to him. We became friends. He seemed to me one who would drive the country forward, who would really do something. He really recruited me. Throughout the film, Putin artfully takes opportunities to stress the good qualities of the KGB. Where he served, he insists in response to a delicate question of whether he abused his position to take bribes. Such actions were considered a betrayal of the motherland and would be punished with the full force of the law. As for being an official, a chinovnik, the word need not have any negative connotation, he claims. He served his country as a military chinovnik. Now he was a civilian official, serving, as he has before, his country, outside the realm of political competition. By the end of the documentary, 𝙲𝚑𝚘𝚗 appears to have fully brought in. The film concludes with a nod and a wink to a glorified KGB past. Putin is shown surveying the icy river Neva, wrapped against the cold in a fur hat, a man of the people behind the wheel of the white Zhiguli, the boxy car ubiquitous in those days. As he watches over the city with a steely and protective gaze, the film closes to the strain of the theme tune from a popular Soviet TV series, 17 Moments of Spring, that made a hero out of the undercover KGB spy who had infiltrated deep into Nazi Germany's ruling regime. It was 𝙲𝚑𝚘𝚗's choice. He was a person exactly out of his profession. I wanted to show how it turned out that he was still in the same profession. Putin, however, had taken care in the interview to give the impression he had resigned from the KGB as soon as he had turned to Leningrad, as St. Petersburg was called in February 1990. He had told 𝙲𝚑𝚘𝚗 that he had left for all kinds of reasons, not for political ones, indicating that he had done so before starting work in May of that year with 𝙲𝚑𝚘𝚗, then a law professor of Leningrad State University and fast-rising star in the city's new democratic movement. Putin had returned to the Tsarist-era capital from 5 years of service in Dresden, in East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, or JDR, where he had served as the liaison officer between the KGB and the Stasi, the East German secret police. Later, legend had it that he had confided to a colleague that he had feared he might have no better future than working as a taxi driver on his return. Apparently, he was keen to create the impression that he had cut off all ties from the old masters, that Russia's rapidly changing order had cast him adrift. What Putin had told 𝙲𝚑𝚘𝚗 was just the start of the string of falsehoods and obfuscations surrounding his KGB career. In the imploding empire that he had returned to from Dresden, nothing was quite as it had seemed. From the KGB villas, perched high on the banks of the river Elbe overlooking Dresden, still elegantly sprawling, Putin had already witnessed at first hand the end of the Soviet Empire's control of the GDR, the collapse of the so-called socialist dream. The Soviet Union's Warsaw Pact power bloc had shattered around him as the citizens rebelled against the communist leaders. He had watched first from afar as the aftershocks began to reverberate across the Soviet Union. Inspired by the Berlin Wall's collapse, nationalist movement spread ever more rapidly across the country, forcing the communist leaders Mikhail Gorbachev into even more compromise with new generations of democratic leaders. By the time Putin's interview with 𝙲𝚑𝚘𝚗, one of those leaders, Boris Yeltsin, had emerged victorious from attempted hardline coup in the August of 1991. The abortive Putsch had sought to turn the clock back on the political economic freedoms, but ended in resolute failure. Yeltsin banned the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The old regime suddenly seemed to have been swept away. But what replaced it was only a partial changing of the guard, and what had happened to the KGB was a case in point. Yeltsin had decapitated the top echelon of the KGB, and then signed a decree breaking it up into 4 different domestic services. But what emerged in its place was a hydra-headed monster in which many officers like Putin retreated into the shadows and continued to serve underground, while the powerful foreign intelligence services remained intact. It was a system where the rules of normal life seemed to have long been suspended. It was a land of half-truths and appearances, and, while underneath it all, fictions of the old elite continued to cling to what remained of the reins. Putin was to give several different versions of the timing and circumstances of his resignation from the KGB, but according to one former KGB officer close to him, none of them are true. He would tell interviewers writing the official biographies that he had resigned a few months after began working with 𝙲𝚑𝚡 at the university. But his resignation letter had somehow gotten lost in the post. Instead, he claimed, 𝙲𝚑𝚡 had personally telephoned Vladimir Putin, then KGB chief, to ensure the resignation at the height of the hardline August 1991 coup. This was the story that became the official version, but it sounds like fiction. The chances of 𝙲𝚑𝚡 reaching Kryakov in the middle of the coup in order to secure the resignation of one of his employees seemed very slim at best. Instead, according to the close Putin ally, Putin continued to receive paychecks from the security services for at least a year after the coup's attempt. By the time he had resigned, his position at the top of Russia's second city's new leadership was secured. He'd perpetrated deep into the country's new democratic leadership, and was the point man for the administration's ties with law enforcement, including the KGB's successor agency, the Federal Security Services, or the FSB. His performance as deputy mayor, as clearly presented in Khan's interview, was already slick and self-assured. The story of how and when Putin actually resigned, and how he came to work for 𝙲𝚑𝚡, is the story of how the KGB cadre began to morph in the country's democratic transformation and attach themselves to the new leadership. It's the story of how a fraction of the KGB, in particular parts of the foreign intelligence arm, had long been secretly preparing for the change in the tumult of the Soviet Union's perestroika reforms. Putin appears to have been part of the process while he was in Dresden. Later, after Germany unified, the country's security services suspected he was part of a group working on special operations, Operation Luch, or Sunbeam, that had been preparing since at least 1988 in case of East German regime collapse. This operation was to recruit a network of agents that would continue to operate for Russia long after their fall. Dresden. When Putin arrived in Dresden in 1985, East Germany was already on borrowed time. On the verge of bankruptcy, the country was surviving with help from $1 billion Deutschmark loan from West Germany. While voices of dissidence were on the rise, Putin arrived there at the age of 32, apparently fresh from stinted training at the KGB elite Red Banner Academy for foreign intelligence officers, and began work in an elegant Art Deco villa with a swept staircase and a balcony that overlooked a quiet, brightly painted neighbourhood street. The villa, surrounded by leafy green trees and rows of neat family homes for Stasi elite, was around the corner from the greyish ball of the Stasi headquarters, where dozens of political prisoners were held in tiny windowless cells. Hans Madrow, the local leader of the ruling Communist Party, the SED, was known as a reformer, but he was also heavy-handed in efforts to clamp down on dissidents. All around the Eastern Bloc, the mood of protest was increasing amid the misery of the shortages of the planned economy and the brutality of the state law enforcement agencies. Sensing an opportunity, the US intelligence agencies, with the help of the Vatican, had quietly started operations to funnel printing and communication equipment and cash to the Solidarność protest movement in Poland, where dissidents against the Soviet Union had been the strongest. Vladimir Putin had long dreamt of a career in foreign intelligence. During the Second World War, his father had served in the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. He'd operated deep behind lines trying to sabotage German positions, narrowly escaping being taken prisoner, and then suffering near-fatal wounds. After his father's heroics, Putin had been obsessed from an early age with learning German, and in his teenage years he'd been keen to join the KGB, that he had called into its local Leningrad office to offer his services even before he had finished school, only to be told that he had to graduate from university or serve in the army first. when, in his 30s, he'd finally made it to the elite Red Banner School for Foreign Intelligence Officers. It was an achievement that looked to have secured his escape from the drab struggles of his early life. He had endured a childhood chasing rats around the stairwells of the communal apartment buildings and scuffling with other kids on the street. He'd learned to channel his appetite for street fights into mastering the discipline of judo, a martial art based on the subtle principle of sending opponents off balance by adjusting their attacks. He'd closely followed local KGB officials' recommendations on what course he should take to secure recruitment into the security services and studied at Leningrad University's law faculty. Then he graduated in 1975. He'd worked for a while in Leningrad KGB counterintelligence division, at first in an undercover role, but when he finally attained what he was officially said to have been the first foreign posting, the Dresden station, Putin arrived at appeared small and low-key. A far cry from the glamour of the station in East Berlin, where about 1,000 KGB operatives scurried to undermine the enemy's imperial powers. When Putin came to Dresden, there was just 6 KGB officers posted there. He shared an office with an old colleague, Vladimir Putin, who called him Volodya, or Little Vladimir, and every day he took his 2 young daughters to the German kindergarten from the nondescript apartment building he lived in with his wife, Lyudmila, and the other KGB officers. It seemed a humdrum provincial life, far away from the cloak and dagger drama of East Berlin, the border with West Berlin. He apparently played sports and exchanged pleasantries with the Stasi colleagues, who called the Soviet visitors the friends. He engaged in small talk on German culture and language with 𝙲𝚑𝚊𝚙𝚚𝚎, the affable special assistant to the Dresden Stasi chief, who was the fixer-in-chief, the lieutenant colonel who knew everyone in town and was in charge of organising safe housing and secret apartments for agents and informants, and for procuring goods for the Soviet friends. He was very interested in certain German idioms. He was really keen on learning such things, 𝙲𝚊𝚙𝚎 recalls. He seemed a modest and thoughtful comrade. He had never pushed himself forward. He was never in the front line, he said. He had been a dutiful husband and a father. He was always very kind. But relations between Soviet spies and their Stasi colleagues were sometimes fraught, and Dresden was far from East Germany's backwaters it may have appeared to be. For one thing, it was on the front line of the smuggling empire that had for a long time served as a lifeline for the GDR's economy. As the home Robotron, the biggest electronical manufacturer in East Germany, producing mainframes and personal computers and other devices, it was central to the Soviets' GDR battle to illicitly obtain the blueprints and components for Western high-tech goods, making it a key cog in the Eastern Bloc's bitter and failing struggle to compete militarily with the rapidly developing technologies of the West. In the 70s, Robotron had successfully cloned the West's IBM, and it had developed the close ties with West Germany's Siemens. Most of East German high-tech smuggling came through Dresden, said Franz Sedlmayr, a West Germany security consultant who later worked with Putin in St. Petersburg and started out in the 80s in the family business in Munich selling defense products to NATO and the Middle East. Dresden was a center for the black market trade. It was also a center for 𝙲𝚘𝚌𝚙𝚎𝚑, a department within the East German Foreign Trade Ministry that specialized in smuggling operations for high-tech goods under embargo from the West. They were exporting antiques and importing high-tech. They were exporting arms and importing high-tech, said Sedlmayr. Dresden was always important to the microelectronic industry, said Horst Ďurmlík. The espionage unit, headed by the East German legendary spy master Markus Wolf, did a lot for this, added Ďurmlík. He remained tight-lipped, however, on what exactly they did. The Dresden Stasi, foreign intelligence chief, Herbert Korn, served at the same time as the head of its Information and Technology Agency unit, a sign of how important smuggling embargoed goods for the city. Ever since Germany was carved up between East and West in the aftermath of World War II, much of the Eastern Bloc relied on black market smuggling to survive. The Soviet Union's coffers were empty after the ravaging of the war, and in East Berlin, Zurich, Vienna, organized crime groups worked hand in hand with the Soviet security services to smuggle cigarettes, alcohol, diamonds, rare metals through the black market to replenish the cash stores of the security services' Eastern Bloc. Initially, black market trade had been seen as temporary necessities. The communist leaders justified it to themselves as a blow against the foundations of capitalism. But when, in the 1950s, West united against the Soviet-controlled blocs to place embargoes to all high-tech goods that could only be used for military means, smuggling became a way of life. The free choice of capitalism and the drive for profit in the West was fueling a boom in technology development there. By comparison, the planned socialist economy of the Eastern Bloc was frozen far behind. Its enterprises were bound only to meet annual production plans. Its workers and scientists left to procure ever the most basic goods through informal connections on the grey market. Isolated by the Iron Curtain, smuggling became the only way for the Eastern Bloc to keep up with the rapid development achievements of the Western capitalists. The East German Foreign Trade Ministry, set up by the Kommissariat appointed the glamorous Alexander Szauszek-Glogowski as the chief. Its mission was to earn illicit hard currency through smuggling, to bankroll the Stasi acquisitions of embargoed technology. The Coco, as it was known, answered first to Markus Wolf, Stasi Espionage Department, but then became a force upon itself. A string of front companies was set up across Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein, headed by trusted agents, some with multiple identities, who brought in vitally needed hard currency through smuggling deals and the sales of illicit arms to the Middle East and Africa. All the while, the Soviet masters sought to keep a close eye on those activities. The KGB could access all the embargoed high-tech blueprints and goods collected by the Stasi. Often, the Stasi complained that their intelligence gathering was a one-way street. At the time of Putin's arrival in Dresden, West Germany was becoming ever more important as a source of high-tech goods. The KGB was still recovering from a major blow in the early 80s, when Vladimir Putin, an officer of its Directorate T, specialized in procuring Western technologies, offered his services to the West. Petrov handed over the names of 250 KGB officers working on Line X, the smuggling of technologies, in embassies across the world, as thousands of documents which provided a breakdown of the Soviets' industrial espionage efforts. As a result, 47 agents were expelled from France, while US began developing an extensive program to sabotage the Soviets' illicit procurement networks. The KGB was doubling down on their efforts in Germany, recruiting agents in companies including Siemens, Bayer, 𝙲𝚑𝚅, and 𝙲𝚑𝚅𝚛. Putin was clearly involved in the process, enlisting scientists and businessmen who could assist in the smuggling of Western technologies into the Eastern Bloc. Robotron's status as the biggest electronic manufacturer in East Germany made it as a magnet for vital businessmen from the West. I know that Putin and his team worked with the West, and that they have contacts in the West. But mostly, they recruited their agents here, said Putin's Stasi colleague 𝙲𝚅𝚌𝚑. They were after students before they left for the West. They tried to select them and figure out how they could best interest them. But 𝙲𝚅𝚌𝚑 was far from aware of all the operations of his KGB friends, who frequently went behind the backs of their Stasi comrades when recruiting agents, including in the Stasi itself. 𝙲𝚅𝚌𝚑, for instance, claimed he had never heard that Putin used a cover name for sensitive operations. But many years later, Putin told students he had adopted several technical pseudonyms for foreign intelligence operations at the time. One associate from those days said Putin had called himself Platov, the cover name he had first been given in the KGB's training academy. Another name he had reported used was Adamov, which he had taken in the post as the head of the House of the Soviet-German Friendship in the neighborhood city of Leipzig. One of the Stasi operatives Putin worked closely with was a short, round-faced German, Matthias Wartnig, who was later to become the integral part of the Putin regime. Wartnig was part of the KGB cell organized by Putin in Dresden under the guise of the business counselor. One former Stasi official recruited by Putin later said, in those days, Wartnig was a hotshot, said to have recruited at least 20 agents in the 1980s to steal Western technology, Western military rockets and aircraft technology. He had risen fast through the ranks since his recruitment in 1974, becoming deputy head of the Stasi Information Technology Unit by 1989.